All right, so welcome back to part 2 of lecture guide number 6, the High Italian Renaissance, and we're working on Michelangelo Buonarroti. So, a little bit of backdrop. I mean, most people know the name of Michelangelo, one of the great Italian master artists of the Italian High Renaissance. Unlike the other artists that we'll see, Michelangelo considered himself to be a sculptor first and foremost and a painter secondarily. As a matter of fact, he argued for sculpture being more important than painting and that it was more three-dimensional, more idealistic, more in the form of perfection that God put on this earth, whereas painting always had to be a little bit illusionistic. He was a prodigy. He was an exceptional artist at a very young age. He entered the guild system under a master artist early on, and then very quickly kind of got adopted into the famous Medici family. The Medici, I've mentioned this name before, but they are the ruling family of Florence. They were part of this rise of middle-class families. They were originally merchants and then bankers who made tons of money off of that and will eventually, as we've already kind of foreshadowed, take over the papacy. And they were deeply devoted to classical arts. They not only collected tons of classical sculptures and paintings, they also collected classical manuscripts, text, philosophical texts in particular, and started what was known as the Neoplatonic Academy, which was a kind of school or salon, people gathering together to talk about the ways that classical philosophers could be used for to understand Christian theology, that was run by probably the most famous philosopher of this time, Marsilio Ficino. And the reason I bring all this up is to say that Michelangelo would have been taught by this man. He would have bounced ideas off him. He would have understood Neoplatonism inside and out. And it is the fundamental kind of aesthetic philosophy of his art that to create the ideal form is to create the closest approximation to God on this earth. Now, I've given you a long reading by Sir Anthony Blunt, who writes about Michelangelo's work and talks about his work in terms of three fairly distinct moments in his career that correspond quite closely with the context in which Michelangelo is working. He had a very, very long life. He lived to be almost 90 years old, and he worked for the vast majority of that time period. Sir Anthony Blunt, in this kind of three-part understanding of Michelangelo's career, places first and foremost his interest in Neoplatonism and beauty as a representation of the divine on earth. And then, as we'll see, around mid-career, Michelangelo, because the context has changed quite dramatically, the rise of Protestantism in the north affects him, the rise of what is known as the Counter-Reformation in response to the Protestant Reformation by Catholics is something that absolutely influences, for instance, his Last Judgement theme, which we'll see. And then at the end of his career, Sir Anthony Blunt argues that Michelangelo has completely kind of moved away from Neoplatonism towards a more spiritualistic representation of humanity. And we'll pick that up as we go along today. So Michelangelo starts with the great Cosimo de' Medici. He works under Lorenzo the Magnificent as well. He is constantly being patronized by these families and by the Pope. He is the most sought after artist of his day, with perhaps the exception of Raphael. However, his career extends much, much beyond Raphael's. Raphael dies in 1520, and Michelangelo continues to work all the way until the 1560s. What I have in front of us is this glorious work of art that Michelangelo did early on in his career, known as the St. Peter's Pietà. Now, Pietà is a term that references the idea of pity. That's literally what Pietà means. It's basically a lamentation scene in which the body of Christ who has died is lamented over by, in this case, the Virgin Mary, and in later examples by others as well. It wasn't a particularly popular subject in Italy at this moment, more popular in the north, but Michelangelo, through his own work, brings this back into popularity. It's a last moment of kind of paying our respects and glorifying Christ before his resurrection into heaven, in other words. Now, being a sculptor, Michelangelo worked primarily in marble. And the marble that he used for almost all of his sculptures is Carrara marble. Carrara marble is an incredibly white, crystalline, beautiful marble that actually comes from the Carrara quarries that had been used since Roman times to make Roman art. He was a consummate craftsman, Michelangelo, so he would go to the quarries himself and pick out the blocks of marble that he wanted to work from, for the most part. There are a few exceptions that I'll note along the way. And I bring this all up because what he's working with is a process known as subtractive sculpture. Unlike bronze casting, where you build up form, Michelangelo, of course, started with a giant block, and if rumors have it true, he would draw on the exterior of this rock as if you were drawing kind of a figure, and then carve away everything around it. Now, while we're on that subject, I just wanted to give you one of the most famous quotes of Michelangelo, and he's got many really smart things to say about art, but this is the one that you hear quite a bit, that if you think about it, is a really nice articulation of Neoplatonic ideas. Michelangelo once said, "The greatest artist has no conception which a single block of marble does not potentially contain within its mass, but only a hand obedient to the mind can penetrate to this image." Now read that over a couple of times and think about Neoplatonism. What he's saying is something like, God put perfection in all things. It's there already in the mass of marble block. And all I do is I open myself to God, my mind to God, and allow my hand to take away all of the things that obscure God's perfection and beauty in the world. And that allows me to carve the forms that I carve. It's, in a way, it sounds simple. God already put it there and I'm just clearing away the other stuff. And it's not at all. Marble is not like the marble that you have on your countertops. It's the carving marble is a little bit easier to carve, but it's still a fairly hard stone. And so I will just kind of have you remember that everything that you're looking at when it's a Michelangelo sculpture started off as a giant stone, and then he carved it into the beauty that it is in its final form. So a close-up of this then. The Virgin Mary holding in her lap her dead child. And in some ways, it's not quite as, let's say, glorifying as Pietro Perugino's work that shows no sign of sorrow. And in other ways, it's the most beautiful thing that you've ever seen in your life. This is in the Vatican in Rome. It's about life size, maybe a little bit over life size, especially when we're talking about Mary. And it represents kind of basic Neoplatonic ideas. And we'll talk about these, but really what I want you to do is, if you can't get a good image of this sculpture here, go Google search this and just look at this darn thing. It's just amazing. The Neoplatonic notion of this is, of course, beauty is divine, and it goes along with truth and goodness. Thus, to represent Christ and to represent the Virgin Mary, they must obviously be beautiful. In this work, of course, it is a pyramidal form. The whole thing is set up as a giant kind of pyramid here, right? With Christ laying across the lap, I can see that basic kind of pyramidal form. The Neoplatonic ideas are just, it's a perfect, ideal set of proportions. It does look like it's sleeping more than it's dead. It looks beautiful. The Virgin Mary, who historically, if we were to be accurate about this, gave birth at 14 or 15 years old. Christ died when he was 34 or 33 years old, so she should be in her late 40s at the very least, and she still looks pristinely beautiful. And the reason for that is probably that, of course, she is good and true, so she must be represented beautifully as well. Close up of her face just to show you this. Remember, this is all stone to look carved to look that ideal. And of Christ's face, again, all stone. This is crazy complex to do this with all these kind of interlocking forms. To carve this away, to look this way, is just, it's beyond comprehension for most of us. Move on, in a way, one of the things I want you to do is just marvel at how good Michelangelo is at what he does. One of his most famous works is the David sculpture. David, I show you this picture here to start us off because it gives you a sense of the scale, is a bit over 14 feet tall. And he represents a figure who we've come across slightly before. He's one of the original of the major Jewish kings. But in this story that we're seeing here where he slays Goliath, this all occurs before he actually becomes a king. When he's a young boy, remember Donatello's sculpture about this, he goes up against the much more powerful Goliath and slays him by throwing a rock from his sling, hitting him in the head and running up and cutting off his head, and thus securing the victory against an overwhelming force for the Israelites. David is the patron saint of Florence, and so it makes perfect sense that you would pick this work as your subject. This work was created for the Florentine City Council, but the story goes a little bit further than that. The way that this sculptural commission came about is that there was this giant block of marble that had been sitting outside of the Duomo, which is the Florence Cathedral, for years because an earlier sculptor had started to carve it and had come across a flaw in the marble and didn't think he could work around that. The Medici family, at the time that this commission came about, had been temporarily banished from Florence by the rich, almost exclusively aristocratic people of Florence who formed the city council. They'll eventually come back, of course. And while the Medici were gone, this Florentine City Council commissioned this work of art. And the way that they did it was they held an open call for artists to submit ideas for the use of this partially carved marble. And Michelangelo submitted the best, proposal, and they went with it. They probably had in their mind as well that Michelangelo, having been so closely associated with the Medici, in a way, it's kind of a coup for them. They get the artist of the Medici to carve the sculpture for them, and even further than that, David represents morally the triumph of rightness over might, right? Remember this from earlier on, the triumph of moral goodness over a more powerful Goliath. They correspond the Florentine City Council, with themselves. They think of themselves as right, and the powerful Medici family with all of their wealth as kind of a Goliath that they're slaying. And so you can see the symbolism for them. Michelangelo probably didn't buy into that idea at all, and it's not even clear that he is aware of that. In any case, he set to work on creating this sculpture of David out of this giant block of marble, and, he knocked it out of the park. David, right? And you look at this form, and I have yet to find anyone say that this is not a beautiful male form. I don't care what your sexuality is. This is extraordinarily beautiful when it comes to the representation of the male form. And remember, this is before the age of people going to gyms and working out all the time. This is his, perfect male form. And the idea is very Neoplatonic. If David is the chosen kind of hero of God, he must be in God's image, and therefore he must be represented ideally and beautifully. The beauty of the male form here represents his divinity, the fact that he has been chosen by God, and that of course he will beat Goliath for being chosen. However, and this is where things get interesting, on the one hand, this is totally typically, classical form. It's in the contrapposto. It seems to be based on ideals. But Michelangelo never bought into the idea of mathematical ideals. He always went with what looked best to his eye. And in this case, if you were to submit this to a canon of proportions, for instance, if you were to take Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man and think, okay, it's got to have 8 heads to the entire body and the proportions to be such and such, it doesn't work. It's a little bit too long. The hands are a little bit big, the feet a little bit big, and people have wondered forever what the explanation for this is. And I think, although there are many different possibilities, the most compelling explanation is that originally when the sculpture was created, it was meant to be on the wall of the Duomo, this great cathedral, up over 2 stories high. And so the elongation of this form, the fact that it's stretched out, if you were to be looking at this from 2 stories below, would be foreshortened by the fact that you're down low looking at something at high. And Michelangelo seems to have been taking that into account. He wants to show you the details of the hands. He wants to show you the details of the face. So there's a little bit bigger head and bigger hands than one would expect. That's all because of where you would have been originally expected to see this from. Now, after he got done creating this, it was so glorious, so beautiful. Everyone chimed in. I mean, there are about 50 different letters that still exist from people weighing in on where this should be shown, that the Florentine City Council decided they weren't going to waste it on the wall of the cathedral, and they set it up out in front of the cathedral so that people could see it very up close. The other explanation for the rather peculiar proportions, the elongation, the largeness of the hands and the feet, and so forth, which I don't quite buy into, but it's worth giving it to you, is that since David was meant to be a youth, and since we know young men oftentimes grow a little bit disproportionately, Michelangelo was trying to show that in his work. Major idea, though, the ideal male body, since men are made in God's image, is the closest approximation to God that we have on earth. The other things that I want to point out about this is that while you can walk all the way around it, in other words, it's sculpture in the round, all classical arts are created with an ideal viewpoint in mind, and you're looking at it right now from that ideal viewpoint. When we get to later Baroque arts, they are meant to be walked around and seen from all sides, and their compositions are a little bit more complex. Notice how David's body seems very relaxed in that contrapposto pose. You can even see that opposition between engaged and free forms. Look at how this leg is engaged, and over here this part of the body is engaged, while over here it's a little bit more languid. That's kind of typical, comes straight out of Greek times. He holds over his shoulder his sling that he'll use to throw the stone. His other hand holds the stone. Behind this leg, this little stump form, that's just something to hold this whole thing up. It buttresses it. You have to do that with marble sculpture. And the only place that he shows animation is in his face, as if he's just turned, seen Goliath, has registered his presence, and is starting to gather his energy. Everything else is kind of typical Italian Renaissance riposo. There it is, the animation of the eyebrows, the furrowed forehead, the very concentrating look on the face. Everything else is typically languid. The very strong undercutting of the hair, all of this attention paid to strong kind of lines on this. This is, on the one hand, an emphasis on Italian ideas about disegno or line appealing to the emotion or the rational mind, but it's also taking into account that if you're seeing this from 2 stories away, you would want to exaggerate the form so that it would actually show up for you. You some details of it now. He studied anatomy just like Leonardo da Vinci did, so you can actually see beneath the surface of this marble veins and tendons and even the skeleton of the figure. He knows the stuff inside and out. And remember, this is a subtractive sculpture, so you make one mistake, there's no way to fix it. When you see things like this on a sculpture, that finger has been broken off somewhere in the past and has been refixed to the sculpture itself. The picture from behind, maybe for the ladies, I don't know. I just wanted you to see that it works better from the front than it does from the back, and that's because Michelangelo was presuming there would be one ideal vantage point on this figure. As mentioned before, and as most people know, Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The frescoes that you see on the wall here, not the far wall here, this was created much later by Michelangelo, but over here on the sides had already been in place. But the ceiling was basically a blue ceiling with little gold stars all over the place. And Pope Julius II wanted to decorate the space much more richly than it had been, decorated. But also, Pope Julius II, at the time that he commissioned Michelangelo to do this work, had set Michelangelo to work on another sculptural project, which I'll show you some parts of in a moment. It was a memorial tomb to him, and Michelangelo had grand plans for this tomb. He was going to create over 50 life-size or larger than life-size, both marble and bronze sculptures. It was going to take him his entire life to do it, and it was going to cost a fortune. Pope Julius II wanted to take money that had been devoted to that project and redistribute it towards the creation of St. Peter's in Rome. At least this is one of the explanations. And so he set Michelangelo to work on this much cheaper project, which he would spend the next 4.5 years of his life working on. And again, it becomes one of the major masterpieces of art by a man who thought of himself as a sculptor, not a painter at all. And, artistry is not this simple. If you're a great drawer, it doesn't mean that you know how to sculpt at all. So just imagine this Renaissance man who could sculpt, he could paint, he wrote beautiful poetry and philosophy, taking on this commission because his Pope asked him to. He didn't want to do it. And spending the next 4-ish years on scaffolding, leaning back at 3/4, painting this on wet plaster. It's crazy. From this vantage point, you can see as well that the Sistine Chapel ceiling is a barrel vault. It's based upon this kind of semi-circular turn. It's based upon the Roman arch, and that's even harder to paint on. All of these things here, while these are architectural elements known as pendentives or spandrels that hold up the arch, they're not decorated. So all of this is painted by Michelangelo in trompe l'oeil to look even more decorative than it originally was. And all of this stuff that I'll show you a close-up of here, which looks like architecture, is also painted in trompe l'oeil to make the interior look even better. It's called an entablature. It's the area just above the columns, but below the actual space of the pediment in a classical sculptural building. Lying on your back, looking at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which rises about 45 feet above you here, this is what it would look like. Over the altar itself, all the scenes, by the way, are from the book of Genesis. Over the altar is God creating the world. He's separating light from darkness. He's casting out the bad angels. He's creating man and woman. They fail in the Garden of Eden. Then he sends the deluge and the flood, and Noah and the ark. All of that stuff is on the ceiling. It's set up where all the major scenes are right down the middle. They alternate from small to large scenes back and forth. And off to the side are a whole bunch of other elements that I'll give you here in a moment. You get close here, of scenes, and you see the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. I'll show you some of these up close, all the way to the drunkenness of Noah down here. The way that this works is off to the side in the pendentives and the spandrels, you have the ancestors of Christ. So over here, you can actually see in the top left-hand side, David slaying Goliath. David was understood as an ancestor of Christ. In between those triangular forms are Old Testament prophets alternating with what are known as Sibyls, who are non-Christian prophets, all presumed to tell of the coming of Christ. In between these, you have columns that are known as caryatids, columns that have figures rather than just kind of round cylinders to hold up everything above them. And then in between them, at the top of the pendentives, you see bucrania. These are just bull skulls. They represent ancient Rome and the power of God. And then all around this, on the top of the entablature, so this architectural setting, are what are known as innuendo. Innuendo are just beautiful, youthful males meant to represent the idea of the ideal. In between them are medallions with various scenes from history and the Bible in them. And then, of course, the main kind of scenes running down the middle. The most famous scene from the Sistine Chapel ceiling is about midway through the Sistine Chapel, and it's this one. This is God creating Adam, or the creation of man. And remember what we said about Neoplatonism, that God created man in his image, as the Bible says. Well, this is a perfect example, again, of Neoplatonic ideas, Neoplatonic aesthetic philosophy. In this case, note how correspondent God's body is to Adam's body, right? They're the same body in the same proportionality. The only difference between the two is that God is active. God is a convex form. He kind of billows out here. God's hand looks like it's got some purpose. God's face looks like he's got determination. He's an active form. Alternately, Adam is a concave form. He's a kind of reverse C. His hand is passive, receiving God's energy. His face, rather than having some kind of will or determination, just shows his love of God. I hadn't probably said it recently, but I'll say it again. This is in the chapel that administers to the clergy of Rome, the most important people of Rome, the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops. They all come to this place. It's not open to the general public, right? And remember what Christians think about sexuality in general. It's something that's pretty questionable. However, nudity becomes appropriate in art because nudity, for at least these, again, Christian works of art, is a representation of God's divine plan. We're made in his image. Putting clothes on the nude body, obscures God's perfection from us. The other component of this that makes nudity okay, especially for the male form, it's not as appropriate for the female form. It's okay, but it's not as appropriate, is that many of these scenes take place in the Garden of Eden before there's a fall from grace. And in the Garden of Eden, remember, Adam and Eve don't even know that they're nude. They're just wandering around because sexuality is not a questionable thing. They don't know that there's anything bad about this or anything objectionable about this. It's kind of like kids wandering around, without their clothes on, because they don't have any understanding of sexuality or the way that nudity is understood by society at large. Close here. That beautiful, perfect form. Again, it's not based upon any canon of proportions per se. However, if you were to measure it out, it's going to be very close to those old Greek forms. Adam is perfect because he's in God's image. If we go over to God where, oh, I'm sorry, I should something about this. Look at this. This is maybe one of the most famous images in art. What is the thing that makes us closest to God? What's the thing that separates us from the rest of animals? It's our opposing thumbs, right? It's our hands. Hands are used to create. God creates using his hand. That's why this is emphasized. But notice also how Adam's hand and God's hand don't touch. There is still a separation between God's perfection and his creations in this universe. A separation between the perfect, ideal paintings and God's perfection. And that's one of the things that this is meant to emphasize here. Also note that, as a fresco, Michelangelo really emphasizes the contour lines of the hands, right? We see these really bold outlines to the hands, and that may be his way of saying disegno, or line, appeals to the mind and not the body. These aren't sensual forms. They're something that are supposed to appeal to the intellect. Over to God. He flies into the scene, by the way, with his giant posse, right? He's got a ton of people here in this billowing cape, doing his stuff. Most of the figures in here are angels, and the way that you can tell that is you look at these characters, and if you can't tell their gender, like by contemporary standards, we might think, oh, examples of transgender, not clear if they're male or female, but they're kind of pretty and they're kind of diminutive. You know that you're looking at angels, whether or not they have wings. God looks determined, right? He is active. He's flying into the scene. And then we follow his hand. Imagine this going to Adam up here, through the shoulder over here. And we notice two characters who are clearly not angels. She's clearly a woman. This is clearly a young boy. Who are they? Well, interpretations differ. Some people think, well, obviously, that's got to be Eve, right? She comes next. And if that's Eve, then this must be Cain, who was the first of the children. And, in some ways that makes a lot of sense. However, Michelangelo and many people certainly thought that God was all-knowing. Thus, when he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, part of his divine plan, which of course none of us know, would have been to understand that Adam and Eve are going to screw up. They're going to fall. They're going to be tempted and they're going to fail that temptation. And if that were the case, then he will know that sometime further along the way, he is going to have to create Mary, and this may be Mary, and of course send his only son Christ to earth. And that's one of the interpretations of these characters. That would emphasize the idea that God is all-knowing, that part of his divine plan was the temptation and fall, and the need for Mary, and the need for Christ, and all of these things. The final thing to say about this is you probably noticed the shape of this billowing drapery behind it looks suspiciously like a heart, one chamber of the heart, and that's one of the interpretations. Michelangelo would have known what a heart looked like by his anatomy lessons, and he may be saying God created us all out of his own love, and hearts were even then associated with love. The other interpretation is that this is one hemisphere of the human brain. God created us out of his mind, out of his intellect, and that certainly makes sense as well. By contrast, however, if you look at the very next scene, we see the creation of Eve. This is not the scene that we just saw at all. In a way, it's easy to understand that in this world of Michelangelo, where women were not seen as being as important as men, that he wouldn't have given a big scene to Eve. He also would have been, beholden to this idea that we saw going way back to Bishop Bernward, that Eve, of course, was the evil temptress, and that something about women wasn't to be trusted, even to the contemporary age. And so he doesn't show her in the same way, does he? I mean, Eve's body doesn't look like the ideal of Adam's, and even more importantly, Eve's body doesn't closely correspond with God's body, right? That is a big question. If the Bible says we're both made in God's image, but when it comes to the physical form, since we believe, and I shouldn't say we, Christians believe that we're made in God's image, and God is the Father, in what way is a woman's body the same or in the image of God the Father. But the bigger point is women are not to be trusted. And so you can see Eve coming out of Adam's rib here, as it is said in the Bible, and already looking like she's, submitting to God, already looking like she's done something wrong while God looks at her sternly. In other words, the representation of the genders is something that corresponds with the beliefs of the time. Man is made in God's image. Man is more important. Man is more rational. Man is to be trusted, whereas woman, not so much. And it even shows up in Michelangelo's work. In the scene, you probably notice these figure the Innuendo, beautiful, youthful males meant to exemplify the idea that man is made in God's image. Many people have pointed out, though, that these figures look incredibly sensualized. They look like Calvin Klein models or something of the sort. And many others have noted that there's a lot of question about Michelangelo's own personal sexuality. He clearly admired the male body. He wrote beautiful love poems to a man by the name of Tommaso de Cavalieri, for instance, and he never took a wife. There's no record of him having any girlfriends or being interested in women sexually at all. We don't know whether he was gay or not. We certainly don't know if he practiced homosexuality, but it has led a lot of scholars to wonder whether Neoplatonism is the only way to explain Michelangelo's interest in representing male beauty. Also on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right after the creation of Eve, we go to another big scene. This is a scene known as the temptation and expulsion of Adam and Eve. It's a simultaneous narrative again, multiple different moments in time represented in the same frame, which most artists try to stay away from by this point. But if you're working with the limited space of a chapel ceiling, sometimes you break that rule of rationality. It is, for us now, having seen some representations of this before, kind of familiar. Right down the middle, the axis that separates the Garden of Eden on the left-hand side from the expulsion on the right-hand side, you have the tree. It's a nice device to set up that separation. And in the tree, you have a giant serpent here. And that serpent, as you follow it up, you'll realize is a woman again, just like we saw in the Tre Riche. So we double down on the culpability of Eve. Eve is receiving directly from the serpent, who later on will be associated with Satan, the fruit. Although that fruit's not an apple, it clearly seems to be, by the leaves of this tree, a fig tree. And remember, the fig is the fruit of the great goddess, and the serpent is associated with the cyclicity and fertility that goes along with earth religions that were, they were appropriated by Christianity and framed as negative symbols here. Eve's body, once again, like Leonardo's Leda and the Swan, is a gorgeous female body, but it looks incredibly masculine. If you didn't see breast on this, you would think masculine form, and that's Michelangelo's way of saying she's made in God's image. Adam's form is like we saw in the earlier scene here. If we get up close on this, there's some interesting things going on here. Number one, the way that this is composed, no one can miss it. I'm sorry I have to be the one to point these things out, but follow my cursor here. The fact that Eve is kind of squatting in front of, Adam is squatting in front of Eve's face. We can't miss the innuendo, right? He didn't paint this and then afterwards go, oh my God, I can't believe I accidentally did that. He's doing this on purpose. He wants to invoke the idea of this being more than a transgression against God. He wants to say that there's some sexual innuendo here. Now remember, in the book of Genesis, it says, God made them, he put them in the Garden of Eden, he said, be fruitful and multiply. So sex per se is not necessarily off limits in the Garden of Eden, but remember, it's sex for procreative purposes. Here, the implication or the implicit kind of invocation of oral sex is important, because basically what he's saying is, as I think we know, oral sex is done primarily for pleasure, right? It's not something that you can get pregnant by. It can't produce children. And sex being used for pleasure is something that the Catholic Church frowns upon. It should be always for procreation. So he doesn't show some kind of, or he doesn't imply some kind of sexual behavior that could actually produce children. He could have had Eve, reaching over to the tree and Adam saddling up behind her or something like that. Instead, he wants to show a sexual activity that's purely for pleasure and thus is something off limits according to the Bible itself. The other thing to point out about this is Michelangelo now doesn't let Adam off the hook. It may be Eve that's tempting him, but look at how Adam's reaching into that tree himself to grab some fruit out for himself. When they're cast out, the angel up here on the left-hand side is the Archangel Michael. Notice the changes. The landscape wasn't all that beautiful in the other scene. That's primarily because of the difficulties of fresco and not wanting to clutter a scene with too many things that might distract from the main characters. But it looks like a blasted landscape, doesn't it? The Archangel Michael is pointing, go out this way, but look at how the sword looks like it's stabbing into the back of Adam, making it look even more, aggressive. And the big thing is, look at their faces. Adam and Eve's face look hideous now. And that's that basic idea that beauty is associated with the divine and ugliness is associated with sin. They've sinned, so he's made them ugly now. Notice as well how Adam still has light on most of him, whereas Eve is cast in shadow. Light is God, shadow is evil. Briefly, I wanted to show you some more of these glorious forms. This is the so-called Libyan Sibyl. The Sibyls are these non-Christian prophets that supposedly foretold the coming of Christ. It's just, gorgeous, gorgeous human anatomy and beautiful, luxurious drapery. And remember, this is all painted in fresco. This is so hard to do. It's crazy. Painting on wet plaster. I said before that originally, before he started the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo was hard at work on the tomb or memorial to Julius II. This is a pared down version of that project. It was much bigger originally, that he had been called away to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling for. Originally, the basic program is pretty similar in many Michelangelo tombs. He did a few of these. Down below you see, and you'll see these up close, the so-called slaves. The slaves are at one time kind of dual symbols. On the one hand, they're a symbol of us all being locked in our bodies, locked in our material realm, right? Trapped in the realm of struggles and sin and trying to figure out the right way to do things. They're also, though, symbolic of the many captors that Pope Julius II took. They're prisoners, basically. In the middle register here, you see a kind of what would have been a sculpture of Pope Julius II, flanked by angels, sitting on top of the sarcophagus, and off to his right, our left, his right, is the Virgin Mary, and on the other side is Moses. And then up above would have been other saints and the Virgin Mary here with the child Jesus. The idea overall was we're locked in our earthly existence. When we die, we're released and our soul becomes the perfect, form it had always been in heaven, should we be, of course, faithful to the Christian faith. There are only a few sculptures that actually got created. One of the most famous, of course, is Moses. So this is in Rome. Moses is even seated almost life-size. By that I mean he's way over life-size if he were to stand up. But he's huge. He is an older man by that long beard. That long beard, by the way, is usually used to signify Old Testament patriarchs, as they're known, very important people. And in this case, Moses did something amazing, right? He led the Israelites out of captivity, he parted the Red Sea, and he received the Ten Commandments, or what are known as the tablets of law, which you see underneath his hand here. The Ten Commandments are kind of the original kind of, 10 moral codes for Jews and then become major commandments for Christians. It's worth noting on his head, he has these horns here. Now, those horns are another one of these weird mistranslations that occur when the Bible is translated from Hebrew into Greek and then into Latin. The word for rays, and Moses was said to have rays shining from his head like a halo, got mistranslated as horns, and then he got represented having horns over and over again, and people thought this was appropriate because he's Old Testament and there was kind of a lurking evil or something to him. It got represented over and over again as horns anyway, and so one of the ways that Moses could be identified is by putting horns on his head. And so even by the time that Michelangelo does this, he continues that tradition. Close there, wide-eyed look of Moses is because, again, he has witnessed God firsthand. God came to him as the burning bush, right? So he's seen him, and those are the eyes that have witnessed God. Old marble, right? He carved this whole darn thing out of a big block of stone. The lowest register were these slaves. They're not finished, as many Michelangelo works didn't get finished. The commission kept getting dropped and then getting revitalized. Money would run out. Michelangelo would get working on other projects. Then he'd try to return to it, but it never got finished. And many of these works show you his working process, how he carved away part of the form, but the remaining rock is still here with that rough-hewn, serrated chisel marks all over it. The reason I point that out is when we get to the Baroque period, many sculptors, including Gian Lorenzo Bernini, will look at these works and say, wow, what a cool aesthetic. The figure emerging from the stone is so beautiful. I will do that for a finished work rather than an unfinished work. And the most famous of all of these is the so-called king slave here, which still has a little bit of that rough-hewn stone behind him. The feet aren't fully finished, but everything else is just about there. Now, this is, again, one of those places that a lot of scholars say, hey, the Neoplatonic idea in which beauty is supposed to be intellectual. You're supposed to look at, for instance, Michelangelo's David and say, wow, that beauty is a manifestation of the divine. You're not supposed to look at David and say, wow, where's the model who posed for this? Because that dude is hot and I'd like to meet him, right? It's not supposed to be sensual. It's all supposed to be intellectual. But when you look at this with the shirt pulled up and he's touching himself and the kind of over-exaggerated contrapposto pose, he starts to look a little bit like Donatello's early David, and you kind of have to wonder. Another tomb that didn't quite get finished is this tomb for Giuliano De Medici here by Michelangelo. He created another tomb for Cosimo de Medici. But this one's a little bit more interesting, and everything you see here would have been carved by Michelangelo or his workshop. Some of this background stuff he would have farmed out to other people to do, but the figures he did himself. In the center is a representation of Giuliano de Medici, but just like we saw in the tomb of Julius II, this is Giuliano de Medici not as he looked, but as his soul would look when it was released into heaven, as perfect, as ideal. See, the program was, and originally they were supposed to be at this bottom part down here, below these two figures and below the sarcophagus that's in the middle, river gods to balance this whole thing out. The river gods represented the idea of kind of the primordial stew from which we all come before we're born into the world. And then in this middle register, you see personifications of the woman is night and the man is day. This is the realm of our phenomenal earthly existence, where the tomb and the body would have been laid, although the body was never meant to go inside of this. And then up above, when you die, your soul is released into heaven, and if you're good, you attain your perfect form, which we see there with Giuliano. Giuliano, you can look up portraits of him. I should have thrown one in here just for fun. He was a kind of gangly looking weird dude, frankly. He was no, heartthrob of his day. But in this example, he's got that perfect idealized male body. This is typical if you're trying to figure out, is that like nude or is that supposed to be a breastplate? What is he wearing? The Romans had done this as well. We saw that there's a famous sculpture of Octavian Augustus that does the same thing. He doesn't try to explain that away. It's kind of part maybe breastplate, part perfect human body. So that's the ideal form, right? God has made us all in his image. Giuliano is a great man for Michelangelo. He wants to represent him perfectly. The figure of night and day aren't quite fully finished. The figure of night, the male form, is really not finished, so we're not going to look, at that much. But here we see the personification of night. Night is recognizable as night because in her hair we see a crescent moon and a star in her tiara. We also see other emblems of night, an owl over here, which is a bird of night, nocturnal bird, and over here a bundle of poppies. Poppies are associated with sleep and thus night. And then under her arm is a nod to the idea that in our earthly realm of existence, we're all shelled in these material bodies, but eventually our soul will be released from that. So you see this empty mask of our everyday existence that's supposed to be like a representation of Giuliano, one presumes. One of the most interesting things about this, though, that no one can help kind of comment on is that the female form hardly looks incredibly ideal. As a matter of fact, her proportions of her body are pretty good, but if you look at these breasts here, they're all kind of oddly formed, especially for an artist, if you think about it, that's supposedly interested in the ideal. Many people have noted it's almost like as an afterthought, he just kind of put them there. But the thing is, of course, he didn't have a lot of interest in the female body. These fairly male-formed breasts here may be supposed to be indicative of an older woman who is breastfed or gone through the rigors of life, so to show you kind of the day and night idea. Or it may be that, he just kind of was not very interested in that. Important that you read Anthony Blett's article because in between the works that we've just seen and the work that we're going to look at now, a lot of things happen in the world. Big things upsetting the power of the Catholic Church. I will return to all the ins and outs of the Protestant Reformation when we get to the Northern Renaissance during the 16th century. Continue on with that story. But let me just say in brief, think about this. During Michelangelo's life, these things happen. Early on in 1492, people discover that the world's not flat, it's round, and they don't know how to make sense of this, right? They had always thought that Western Europe is the center of civilization, that God made this world. They don't know how to make sense of the idea that we live on a giant sphere. Soon after this, Girolamo Savonarola starts preaching in the streets of Florence, as I spoke about in earlier lectures, arguing against the cult of the Medici. And those ideas, the cult of the Medici and cult of paganism, the adoption of luxury items as supposedly forwarding ideas of the church, those ideas get taken up again by Martin Luther in the North, where he critiques the Catholic Church for their practice of indulgences and leads huge amounts of Western Europe away from the Catholic Church towards various sects of Protestantism, the protest against the very materialistic, by Protestant standards, use of religion by the Catholic Church. That occurs, and again, this is the second decade of the 1500s. Not long after that, Charles V of Spain marches into Rome and sacks Rome, occupies it for a year, and then leaves. During the 1500s, of course, first Galileo and then later on Copernicus point out that not only is the world not flat but round, but also we're not even in the center of the world. We seem to orbit around the sun. All of these things are upsetting the solidity of the belief system of the Catholic Church. Context matters, and we see it in this work by Michelangelo when he was called back to Rome in the 1520s to create this work, which is known as the Last Judgement, which he didn't get around to starting until the 1530s. 1536 to 1541 are the dates of this. The Catholic Church was already starting to confront the Protestant Reformation. They were already starting to think, how are we going to respond to the criticisms of the Protestant Reformation? Are we going to do anything about it? And I'll let you read about that in your text so as to not make this lecture kind of drag on and on. Michelangelo was a middle of the road guy. He felt like the Catholic Church needed to reform. He didn't believe in the hardliners who said, hey, we've got to get rid of everything. And he also didn't believe with the people who thought everything should just stay the same. The Catholic Church, when he is commissioned to do this work, however, is asking for work from him that's very hard line. And in a way, he gives that to them. This work doesn't follow a lot of the rules of the High Renaissance anymore. The beauty that you see in these male forms doesn't have that youthful beauty that we saw in earlier Michelangelo works. The proportions are all kind of weird. The rationality of this space is really weird. It's a Last Judgement scene, sure, but we don't know where it's taking place or how far away certain figures are from other figures. Even the rational lighting system has completely kind of gone away from this. We don't have the separation of foreground, middle ground, background, none of the linear perspective. You can see everything looks like it's in movement here rather than being stable, but that's all on purpose. Your reading associates this with the middle stage of Michelangelo's career where he's starting to move away from Neoplatonism towards a different kind of beauty, a beauty about the power of religion. So if we look at the central grouping here, what you see is Christ in the middle, in that glowing nimbus, the mandala that we've talked about before, sitting in judgment over all mankind at the end of days. Some will come up into heaven and others will be cast down into hell for all eternity. However, what we don't see that is very kind of, or how this doesn't appear kind of high classical Renaissance is notice the proportionality of these bodies. They all look like very powerful men, but they don't have that youthful beauty anymore. As a matter of fact, they don't have the same kind of standard set of proportionality, especially when you look at Jesus. He's represented in hierarchical scale again, bigger than anyone else. But the biggest point of this is, Jesus looks a little bit angry, and everyone around him who have already been taken into heaven are very fearful, anxious about what's going to happen next, which is not what you find in a lot of classical works. There's a lot of emotion here. So the question then is why? Why do we represent it this way? And the answer may be that the Catholics who commissioned this work of art, which is primarily for the people who were part of the clergy in Rome, wanted to scare that clergy into line, make them follow the ideas of the ruling body of the Catholic Church that existed at the time that this was commissioned. In other words, we're showing people up in heaven who have every right to believe they're going to be there for all time. This is St. Peter over here on the right-hand side, holding the keys to heaven. Over here is John the Baptist, who's going to be in heaven, right? But they're all fearful about what Jesus is going to judge. And one thinks that this is meant to extend to the Catholic Church, who are all doing this in arguing about, what is the right way to respond to Protestantism. And maybe this is a way to scare them into line. So some of the other characters here, some of which I'll refer to, some of which you probably recognize, Underneath his right arm is the Virgin Mary. She's the only one who doesn't look scared in the scene. Everyone else looks on anxiously. As I said before, look at the weirdness of this spatial system. Are these figures up above really that far behind him so as to be diminished that far in size? Doesn't make any rational sense in a way like we expect from the High Renaissance. Down below is Jacob with his ladder. Over here is St. Bartholomew, and I'll return to him. He was a early saint who was martyred by being skinned alive. Right? The close-ups of these things. How did I know this was John the Baptist? By the way, Michelangelo painted all these figures nude, but even while he was painting it, because the Catholic Church started to get nervous about, painting scenes that had nudity, and the Protestants are saying that's totally inappropriate. As he was painting it, they commissioned someone to be the person who came and painted drapery or coverings over all the genitalia. So you can tell this is John the Baptist because not only is he wearing, you can barely see this fur on his back, but he's wearing this weird kind of hair G-string here. St. Peter over here holding the keys. Down in the very bottom of this, these are figures coming out of their graves, surrounded by the dead and demons, oftentimes waiting their judgment. And this is right down on the level that you would see this kind of at eye level. Right in front, I should have mentioned the altar, so that while you're watching the Catholic clergy, the priest in front of the altar doing mass and so forth, this is what's facing you. It's the opposite of Giotto's work where it's on your exit wall that you see this. This is the whole thing that they're looking at. All of this and damnation and judgment. What's interesting scenes is way down on the bottom right-hand side where we see the sinful who are beyond redemption being cast into hell. And in hell, Michelangelo has taken scenes from ancient classical mythology to represent as hell. What we have here off to the far left-hand side is Charon. Charon is, in Greek mythology, the ferryman who takes the dead across the river Styx into Tartarus. He's also, of course, the character that we greet if you've read Dante Alighieri in his book, The Inferno, who is beating the crap out of all the unredeemables. And that's certainly where Michelangelo gets this. You can see him getting ready to smack all these sinners. Then they are all cast into hell and tormented by various devils, including this guy that's off to the far right-hand side. Cesena di Biagio, who was a major critic, a member of the clergy, but a major critic of Michelangelo, and his major criticism had to do with nudity. Michelangelo surmised that Biagio's fear of nudity had to do with his own sinfulness, and so after getting an earful from this man, what he decided to do is represent his features. So this is Biagio's features on a figure who is identified as King Minos. King Minos shows up in Dante Alighieri's Inferno as well, as a symbol of everything evil in the world. He's the ancient king of Crete who presided over the time of the labyrinth and the Minotaur and so forth. And he's represented in this case, just as we saw before in Botticelli's work when he represented Midas, a slightly different character with donkey ears to show his sinfulness, but also to associate him with lust. We see the serpent, which in Dante's work wraps around his body, and in this case does kind of unmentionable things to his genitalia so as to associate him with lust. Again, the point of this is that he puts the features of someone who is his enemy on this evil character in classic mythology and in Dante Alighieri's writing of the early Renaissance, so as to kind of get him back. Representation of the doomed, someone who didn't redeem themselves, didn't repent their sins, failed to follow the word of Christ. It's meant to be scary. It's meant to instill fear in you, make you kind of toe the line. And then this scene of St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew was flayed alive, and and he's an important saint. He believed in Christ and stood up for his beliefs, even though he was going to be skinned to death. But the most important part of this is that the skin here is represented, in the features of the skin are the features of Michelangelo. Now, what is he saying here? Is this just a kind of cameo appearance in his own work? Well, as you'll read in Anthony Blunt's essay, this may be Michelangelo starting to lose faith in the idea that beauty is a representation of divinity. In other words, that beauty here is skin deep for Michelangelo mid-career. Briefly, I wanted to show you this thing that Sir Anthony Blunt talks about as well. It's a later Pietà, known as the Florence Pietà. It shows in the center Christ, and off to the right, it's an unfinished work, an unfinished Virgin Mary, one of the nondescript figures over here, not important for you to remember who this is. And then up above, Nicodemus, and Nicodemus, who is very often represented at the crucifixion and lamentation scenes, is also carved with the likeness of Michelangelo. The most important part of this is this corresponds date-wise with the Last Judgement scene, and you can probably tell this is a heck of a lot more emotionally disturbing representation of Christ than that earlier Pietà. It still has the pyramidal form, but look at what he's done. He's tipped Christ's head over to touch Mary's face, making it even more personal. And the body of Christ is set up as a series of broken diagonals that exacerbate all of our emotional responses to this figure. End of his career, Michelangelo, the work that he was working on is the so-called Rondinini Pietà. Now, as Sir Anthony Blunt points out in his article, this is the last work, and this may be indicative of, at the end of his life, Michelangelo turning completely away from humanistic, idealized human form to represent the divine and moving towards some kind of spiritual ideal. And what he means by this is that this form looks ghostly, it's immaterial, it's elongated, it looks like something that might have come out of a Gothic sculpture. And maybe Michelangelo at this point, right before his death, is completely devoted to the idea of spiritual beauty rather than a beauty that represents human ideals. But we'll never know. The other explanation might be that, he's 85 years old, 89 when he dies. Maybe he just couldn't do it anymore, right? Maybe he just didn't have the physical capability anymore. Originally, the sculpture was much bigger, and in the last months of his life, he carved it down to a much more emaciated, elongated form. In any case, remember that these are all interpretations based upon a lot of very sound scholarship, but they are still interpretations. I hope you had fun this week, and I will see you next week when we look at the work of northern Italy in areas like Venice. All right, have a good week.